Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a thinker whose ideas didn't just change history.
They still challenge how we think about society, government rights, and even belief itself. Thomas Paine.
Yeah, forget those simple textbook explanations. We're going deep into Paine's actual arguments.
And we've got something special in mind for our listeners today. Those of you who really love philosophy, like deep philosophical thinking.
Exactly. To guide our exploration, we're relying on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Thomas Paine.
It gives a really detailed look at his life, but even more importantly for us, it unpacks how his thinking developed.
Our goal today is to uncover the heart of Paine's philosophy, to connect with those of you who love to dig into these big ideas.
We're going to break down his arguments, see how they work, and explore how they're still relevant even today.
So first, let's talk about the man himself. Paine had quite a diverse life, didn't he? I mean, how do you think his experiences impacted his philosophy?
Absolutely. Born in England, not to a wealthy family or anything, Paine tried lots of different jobs.
He was a staymaker, right?
That's right. A staymaker, then an excise officer. Then he made that huge move to America.
And of course, he was right in the thick of it during the American and French revolutions.
Yeah, those experiences of radical societal change must have been pretty formative.
Later on, he gets into religious philosophy with Age of Reason, and then comes back to a not-so-welcoming America.
It all paints a pretty interesting picture. It's fascinating to think about how his lack of formal philosophical training, yet being around big thinkers like Franklin and Jefferson, shaped his ideas.
I mean, imagine those conversations. The Stanford entry talks about the ongoing debate among scholars about what really influenced Paine's thought. From a philosophical standpoint, why is it so important to figure out if it was, say, British radicalism, American revolutionary thought, or his time in France that had the biggest impact?
That's such a key question. Figuring out those main influences helps us put Paine's arguments in context. We can understand the assumptions behind his ideas. Like, if British radicalism was the main driver, we'd probably see his arguments about natural rights and the power of the people as coming from that English tradition. But if the American context was more important, we might focus on his practical arguments for independence and creating a republic. Then you've got the French Revolution adding another layer, especially when it comes to ideas about the social contract and the rights of individuals in Europe. So pinning down those dominant influences lets us interpret his ideas in a much more nuanced way, seeing where they fit within the history of philosophy.
Okay, let's dive into one of the central pillars of Paine's political philosophy, his distinction between society and government in common sense.
All right, let's do it.
Can you break down the philosophical importance of this for us?
Sure. Paine says that society is part of human nature. It comes from our needs, our desire to cooperate and be happy.
It's like a natural instinct.
Exactly. But government, he sees that as something we create, something artificial. It's born out of our flaws, our tendency to do wrong, and it's there to keep our bad impulses in check. His famous line, "Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil," isn't just some catchy phrase. Philosophically, it means that human interaction is fundamentally good, but government, even at its best, is a tool, and like any tool, it comes with risks. So that's how he justifies arguing for a small government, a government that doesn't interfere too much because it's always in danger of becoming corrupt or overreaching its power.
That's a pretty bleak view of government. It makes you wonder what kind of government he actually supported. The Stanford entry mentions his preference for a simple republic. What philosophical ideas underpin this preference, especially compared to a monarchy?
Paine believed in the power of the people and the fundamental equality of all individuals, and that led him to champion a republic. He saw monarchy, especially hereditary monarchy, as irrational and unjust because it's based on the idea that some people are just born with a right to rule over others, not because they've earned it or because the people chose them. In common sense, his criticism of King George III wasn't just political, it was a philosophical attack on arbitrary power, on the idea that any one person can have inherent power over others. He compared America to a nation growing up, saying it had matured beyond needing a king, implying this powerful argument for self-determination based on reason and maturity.
And speaking of America, he actually had some early thoughts on how its government should be structured. They weren't super detailed, but what philosophical principles can we see in his suggestions for things like dividing the country into districts, having representation in Congress, and electing a president?
Even though these suggestions were basic, they reflect core Republican principles. Dividing into districts suggests geographically based representation, where the government stays connected to local concerns. Having representation in Congress emphasizes that the people choose those in power, not because of their birthright. And electing a president, instead of having a king, firmly establishes the idea that the people's consent is what makes political power legitimate. Sure, there's not a ton of philosophical argument there, but these ideas point to a system where power ultimately comes from and is accountable to the people. As the Stanford entry says, common sense worked because it appealed to these widely held beliefs rather than trying to be a super sophisticated theory of republicanism.
That makes sense. It seems like common sense was a rallying cry, but his ideas about rights became more developed in Rights of Man. The Stanford entry mentions Edmund Burke's critique of natural rights as a catalyst for Paine's thinking. How did Burke's arguments push Paine to refine his understanding of rights?
All right, so Burke was criticizing the French Revolution, and he argued that people living in a society can't have all the same rights they'd have in a hypothetical state of nature. He thought that for a society to work, individuals have to give up some of their freedom in exchange for security and order. That challenge really made Paine think, and he came up with a clearer distinction between two types of rights: natural rights and civil rights. Natural rights are inherent to every human being. We keep them even when we join a society, and civil rights are those we rely on society to protect. With this distinction, Paine argued that while some of our natural powers might be given to the government to ensure civil rights are protected, think of things like property rights, certain fundamental natural rights, like freedom of conscience, are off limits. The government can't touch those.
That distinction between natural and civil rights seems crucial to understanding Paine. The Stanford entry talks about his letters back and forth with Thomas Jefferson about this. What was the heart of their agreement or disagreement? Why is it so important from a philosophical standpoint?
Paine and Jefferson were largely on the same page about the difference between natural and civil rights. Jefferson's emphasis on unalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence fits really well with Paine's idea that some natural rights are retained even in a society. Their letters probably focused on clarifying the boundaries between these categories and what that meant for the government's power. This shared understanding was foundational to the American project of self-government and remains a key philosophical contribution to understanding how individual freedom exists within a social and political structure. It's really about answering that fundamental question. What aspects of individual freedom are so vital that they can't be infringed upon by the group, by society as a whole?
Let's get into Paine's concept of sovereignty. It's implied in common sense, but the Stanford entry highlights dissertations on government as where he really lays it out. How did he define sovereignty, and what crucial qualification did he add to the idea of popular sovereignty?
Okay, so Paine defined sovereign power as the power that's ultimately uncontrollable and that controls everything else. In a republic, he says this power belongs to the people. But here's the catch. He immediately clarifies that when people create a republic, they're making a promise. They're promising to be just and fair to each other, and they're giving up the right to be tyrannical even if the majority wants to. This is where he introduces a difference between what he calls the sovereignty of justice and the sovereignty of will. He's saying legitimate popular sovereignty isn't just the majority doing whatever it wants. It has to operate within the boundaries of justice and protecting individual rights.
That's a pretty big limit on the potential for the majority to become tyrannical. But the Stanford entry also mentions something that seems different in his later writing, around 1791, where he talks about the majesty of the people and the laws being sovereign. How do those ideas fit together with his earlier thinking on sovereignty?
The difference there might just be about emphasis, considering what he was talking about at the time. When he says majesty of the people, he's highlighting where political authority really comes from. When he talks about the representative body as the government and the laws as sovereign, he's talking about how that people's power gets put into action in a republic. The way the Stanford entry reads, it seems like even in these later writings, the basic idea is the same. Government and laws exist to protect civil rights that come from natural rights. So the sovereignty of the law is only legit if those laws uphold justice and protect individual freedoms. It goes back to that sovereignty of justice, the idea that even the people's will is bound by higher principles.
This takes us to Paine's idea of generational sovereignty, which was really radical for its time. He totally rejected Burke's idea that we're bound by what past generations decided. What are the philosophical implications of Paine's argument that each generation is free to govern itself?
Paine's concept of generational sovereignty is a powerful statement about individual autonomy and the rejection of inherited obligations in politics. Philosophically, it challenges the idea that people in the past can limit the choices and freedoms of those who come after them. He said that each generation inherits a fresh start, free to establish its own government and social structures based on its own needs and understanding of justice. It's an idea that probably came from thinkers like Jefferson and maybe even from Adam Smith's focus on individual liberty, as the Stanford entry suggests. This idea has huge implications for how we think about constitutions, the legitimacy of old political institutions, and the ongoing right of people to determine their own future.
It's a strong argument for freedom across time. However, the Stanford entry mentions a tension that Paine wrestled with in dissertations on government. He had to balance the idea of sovereign power with the need to respect agreements made by previous governments. How did he try to resolve this tension between the freedom of each generation and the need for stability and honoring agreements?
He made a distinction between laws and contracts. He said that while each generation has the right to change laws made by earlier generations, contracts are different. They're agreements between people or groups, and they create rights that have to be respected. Going back and changing contracts would violate the principles of justice that make sovereignty legitimate. So this distinction tries to balance the freedom of each generation to shape its own destiny with the need for predictability and protecting rights that came from voluntary agreements.
Turning to the specifics of government structure, the Stanford entry says Paine didn't offer a lot of detailed proposals. He liked republicanism, but his ideas about how those institutions should actually work seem less developed than some of his contemporaries. Why do you think that is, and what can we learn about his vision for a new kind of government from his writing?
Paine was more interested in the big ideas of government sovereignty, rights, the purpose of the state, than the nitty-gritty details of how institutions should be structured. He probably thought that once those big ideas were in place, the specific structures could be adapted to different situations. It's interesting how his concept of republican government changes over time. At first, he defines it by its aim for the public good, but later it becomes associated with government by election and representation. Importantly, and the Stanford entry really emphasizes this, he didn't like to use the word democracy. He thought of it as direct democracy, and he preferred a system of representation built upon democracy, similar to what America has. His big contribution was connecting representation to popular sovereignty, separating it from its historical association with monarchy. He was all about constitutions that are created and revised by the will of the people. He even imagined Europe becoming one giant republic based on these principles.
It's surprising that even though he's considered a radical thinker, he wasn't initially for everyone having the right to vote, as the Stanford entry points out. He came to that later. What changed his mind?
His later support for equal suffrage, which he wrote about in a letter addressed to the addressers in dissertation on first principles of government, came from a deeper commitment to equal rights. At first, he seemed okay with the restrictions on voting that existed at the time. But as he thought more about natural rights and the role of government in protecting those rights, he realized that the right to vote was fundamental. He had two main arguments. First, that paying taxes implied a right to representation, and second, even more importantly, that voting is the primary way individuals can protect all their other rights from being taken away by the government.
His statement comparing denying someone the right to vote to slavery is so powerful. Can you explain the philosophical basis of that analogy for Paine?
Paine believed the core of slavery was being under the control of someone else without any way to have a say or fight back. He argued that if you deny someone the right to vote, you're putting them in a similar position. They're dependent on the decisions of others, and they have no say in those decisions. To him, the vote wasn't just a political privilege. It was a fundamental right that protects all our other rights because it gives us a way to influence the laws and policies that govern our lives. Without it, we're basically at the mercy of whoever holds power, like a slave subject to their master. He even said that when other rights are taken away, the right to rebel becomes fully justified, which shows just how important he thought political participation was.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about a different aspect of his thought, welfare and property. The Stanford entry points out that these proposals for welfare kind of pop up out of nowhere in Rights of Man. What philosophical justification did he give for these ideas? And how did they change when he wrote Agrarian Justice?
The welfare ideas he first presented in Rights of Man seem practical, focused on spending money on social needs after a revolution. But in Agrarian Justice, Paine gives a more principled philosophical argument. He says that the earth was given to all humanity, that we all had a share in it. But when land became private property, it left many people without that share, without their inheritance. To fix this inequality, he proposes a system of ground rent. Landowners would pay a kind of rent to the community, which would be used to fund things like inheritance grants for young people and pensions for older folks. This wouldn't be charity, it would be a right. He made a powerful statement saying that no one should be worse off living in a civilized society than they would be living in a state of nature. That sums up his idea. Everyone deserves a basic level of well-being as compensation for losing their share of the earth.
The Stanford entry points out that Paine was often seen as a libertarian, which seems to clash with his ideas about welfare. How did he reconcile these seemingly contradictory views?
I think Paine saw these reforms as a way to manage a kind of natural inheritance that had been privatized, not as a big expansion of government power. He probably saw funding these programs through a tax on inherited wealth as a way to redistribute some of the benefits of private land ownership back to everyone. He might have argued that these measures were needed to create a society where everyone could truly exercise their natural rights and freedoms. If people are trapped in poverty, they can't exercise their rights. So he might have seen these ideas as necessary to uphold the will of a just and fair society.
Finally, let's talk about Paine's religious views. People often label him as an atheist, but the Stanford entry clarifies that he was a deist. What were the main points of his deistic beliefs as outlined in Age of Reason?
Right. Paine was definitely a deist. He believed in a God who created the universe, but doesn't interfere in its workings. Age of Reason is his critique of organized religion, especially the Bible's authority. He argues for understanding God through reason and by observing the natural world. He was influenced by scientific lectures of his time and saw God as the first cause, the one who designed a universe perfect for humans. He thought our moral duty was to be good like God, which we figure out through reason and nature. A big part of his deism was rejecting religious mysteries, miracles, and prophecies. He saw these as human inventions to control and exploit people, what he called priestcraft. To him, pure and simple deism was the only real religion, the only one that came directly from God.
It's fascinating how his belief in reason influenced his religious views, just like how it shaped his skepticism of unchecked political power. The Stanford entry highlights the impact of Paine's straightforward writing style. Why is that so important, even if his ideas weren't always brand new?
Paine's brilliance was his ability to explain complex ideas in a way that regular people could understand and get excited about. He encouraged people to think critically about the political and religious systems controlling their lives. His clear language and strong arguments bypassed the usual gatekeepers, academics and the elite. His ideas spread quickly and fueled popular movements. Even the Attorney General, when trying to prosecute Paine for rights of man, admitted that the book appealed to everyone, even the ignorant, the gullible, and the desperate. That shows who Paine was trying to reach and how his ideas threatened those in power. Even if his ideas built on existing philosophical ideas, his unique contribution was making them accessible to everyone, turning them into a powerful force for social and political change. Sure, he was criticized and marginalized by some academics, but you can't deny his massive impact on how we think about politics today. To dismiss him as not sophisticated enough philosophically would be missing the point entirely. His accessible philosophy truly helps shape the world we live in.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive for our listeners, we've looked at Paine's basic distinction between society and government. We've unpacked his complex theory of natural and civil rights, his carefully defined understanding of popular sovereignty, his vision of Republican government based on representation and the public good, his arguments for welfare rooted in natural rights, and the idea that we all inherit a share of the earth, and his deistic beliefs that emphasized reason and a God who created the universe but doesn't micromanage it.
And throughout this exploration, we've touched on those big philosophical questions that have been around forever. The nature of rights, the legitimacy of political power, the balance between individual freedom and social order, the foundations of justice, and the role of reason in shaping our beliefs about the world and our place in it.
Here's something to ponder as we finish. If we take Paine's ideas about natural rights and the sovereignty of each generation seriously, what can they tell us about today's philosophical debates? Think about things like, how should we deal with climate change, knowing it affects future generations? Is it ethical for massive amounts of wealth to be passed down through inheritance? What about the impact of technology on basic human rights and freedoms? Could it be that Paine's simple, direct language still has something valuable to say about these complex philosophical problems we're facing now?
We encourage everyone listening to go read Paine's work for themselves and to explore the many interpretations of his ideas that scholars have put forward. The best part of any philosophical journey is forming your own conclusions.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive as we explored the ideas of Thomas Paine.